This is Gene Monterastelli, the editor of TappingQA.com, and welcome to the Tapping Success Summit, Tapping to Strengthen Your Relationships with Sue Beer and Emma Roberts. Sue and Emma are the co-founders of the EFT Center, EFT Founding Masters, and EFT International Master Trainers and Trainer of Trainers. They are the originators and pioneers of the Integrated Energy Technique, IET, bringing together energy psychology and the very best ways of working with Ericksonian hypnosis, NLP, coaching, cognitive psychotherapy, and psychospiritual approaches. Their combined backgrounds have proven to be a strong foundation within which the newer breakthrough approaches of energy psychology continue to grow and develop. Please enjoy my conversation with Sue and Emma. One of the things that we do as humans is there are certain things that we know to go and learn. You know, I learned stuff for school. I was taught how to drive a car. I spent some time this past weekend getting better at pickling vegetables. And in all of those circumstances, there was structure. There is things that we are taught to do. Yeah. And as we were just having a brief conversation about relationship, the thing that struck me is we're impacted by relationships we have in the past and how our relationships are shown to us, but we're never actually taught what relationship is supposed to look like, what we're supposed to interact with, and that sort of thing. And so just as we kind of step into talking about relationships, how do you think that impacts our experience of having relationships, and how do you think that impacts the things that start to show up and getting in the way of us creating the relationships that we want?
Well, I think one of the beliefs that we come across, or certainly I come across with clients, is that they believe that some people are good at relationships and other people just aren't. The clients say things like, "Oh, I've never been any good at relationships." So I think the idea that it's something that we can learn is actually not one that occurs to most people. We're not taught how to have relationships with anyone really, whether it's friendships, siblings, work colleagues. There isn't a format, there isn't a structure for that. There's not like learning to drive, like you say, where there are steps that you go through and then you get assessed on it. So I think this idea that I'll never be any good at relationships. I'll never. A lot of people just give up or don't even bother. Until what I find is that they do enough work on themselves, maybe in another area, clear some blocks and limiting beliefs and start to kind of expand. And then they think, oh, maybe there's a possibility that I might be able to meet someone and have a relationship. That's just one of my observations, that this idea that, I'm not good at relationships and other people are somehow.
Yeah, and I also think people's concept of relationships is very much based on false premises, like Instagram, or social media stuff. Like kind of, you might see somebody and think, oh, they've got the perfect relationship. We've actually got no idea. So you don't know it's all perception from the outside. You don't know what that feels like on the inside. And you actually don't know even if that's true, but there's an awful lot of kind of myth, I think, and fables around the perfect relationship that I think need to be dispelled, actually, individually and collectively.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, as you're talking about what we see as relationship and what we are capable of, somewhere in the last 9 months, I encountered someone talking about this idea that I've really taken root in the work that I'm doing, is that the only way we can change is if we change the way we see ourselves, the way we see the world, or both. And what you've both just elucidated in your answers is both of those things. So you're talking about this idea, like, I see myself as a person who's bad at relationships. Well, if I see something, the subconscious mind wants me to be safe and save energy. So if it thinks I'm not capable of something, it's just going to make sure I don't try. And so even if there is the conscious desire to have it, but the belief I'm not made for that particular thing, then the subconscious mind is going to keep us out of there. And the second thing is like how we see the the world. Well, if we have a distorted perspective of social media feeds, the way friends present their relationships, or, you know, the decades and decades of silly romantic comedies that we have been fed as this is what courting and romantic and relationship looks like, you can see how easily it is for us to then have a difficult part of stepping into that particular thing.
Yeah. I mean, I also think we have to unpick the word relationship. What does that actually mean? You know, it's actually, it's not, we treat it as though it's a thing, and it's actually not a thing. It's a series of things, a series of actions and, you know, behaviors and things. So we need to unpick that with our clients as to what relationship actually means to them. And then I think it's about focusing on relationship to self first, actually.
And before we dive into that sense of relationship with self, I think it's really interesting you're talking about the definition of relationship, because there's kind of two aspects to finding that definition. One is the aspect of what does it mean to me? The other is the context, because there's a difference between a sibling relationship and a relationship with my parents, and a dating relationship and a roommate relationship and a colleague relationship. And we use the exact same word, and occasionally we'll give it a modifier like familial or romantic, but still, like, that's doing a disservice to the nuance of every single type of relationship that we have. And so I think that's fascinating, that I am oftentimes, I'm evaluating my ability to have relationship or the quality of my relationship, I'm doing it to a much more general definition than what it looks like. Like, one of the really healthy things that happened to me in my 20s was the recognition that, like, none of my relationships are equal. Meaning that I am not showing up identically to the person on the other side, because if that was happening, like, I would just be hanging out with myself. And the fact that it's unequal is good. That's the nature of that particular thing. But like I had to transform what I understood the outcome was before I could be in a circumstance to have it in a healthy way.
Absolutely, because each relationship with every single person, I mean, my relationship with Eugene is different to my relationship with Sue, different to my children, different to, you know, my partner, whatever. It's just different. So there is no one construct.
And it's different over time. Like, we had a relationship when the three of us showed up in a blown out airport in the Philippines, and a week later when we were heading back to that airport to leave the country, like, our relationship was very, very different, because even it was a compressed amount of time, but because of all of that amazing experience that we got to have together. So even in the context of that we have different relationships, we have a different relationship today than we did a decade ago, because I've been lucky enough to have you in my life for more than a decade. And so, like, recognizing that particular piece of it as well is knowing that not only is it a different relationship, but each one's going to change, because hopefully both people are changing in that particular sense.
Yeah, the evolution. They're continually evolved. We continually evolve, don't we? Even when we think we're stuck, we're actually not stuck.
Yeah.
So,
do you think there are some relationships where we allow that kind of evolution and that flexibility more than we do in another type of relationship?
Well, I mean, like one of the things I know is that, so the house that my parents live in, even though it looks very different, is the house that we moved into as a family in 1980. So I spent basically from 6 on, it was the house that I grew up in. And a number of years ago, I was home and my brother and I were wrestling around on the kitchen floor. And, you know, 2 men in their 40s should not be wrestling around on the kitchen floor. And we weren't fighting. We were just wrestling around because that's what brothers do. But it's really interesting the way that my brother, my sister, and I, when we go back into that space, we turn back into our 13, 15, 11-year-old selves that we shared that space together, where we don't act the exact same way here at my place, at my brother's place, when we're on vacation together. And so it's interesting that, like, sometimes the relationships change because we're in a growth state. Like, there are relationships in my life where we actively have conversations about the dynamic change of relationships. And some of them, because they're relationships are functional, it feels like we get stuck in a particular spot because that's just the place that we are. And it's a habit as much as maybe an active choice to be acting in a particular way.
It's habit. And maybe it's even a kind of like hypnotic trance state. You know, you go into the house, and that's one trigger, and then your brother is there, that's another trigger, and then all of a sudden you're 10 years old and rolling around on the floor. But people do that in you know, what we might call romantic relationships as well. You know, they go into it, and then something attracts them to that other person that also triggers them, and then, you know, hey ho, they're two 10-year-olds rolling around on the floor, not in a good way.
Yeah.
Well, from different households, basically.
Yeah.
They have different ways of wrestling.
And it's a clash. It's a clash of the households,
Yeah, absolutely. And well, the other thing inside of that you're mentioning, like particularly with like certain type of relationships, that we have multiple of them in our life. We could have multiple romantic relationships. We could have multiple relationships with coworkers. And I'm guessing that as we're trying to create this sort of transformation, as we look at those, like recognizing the histories of our relationships in the past and how we are like they become the archetype of what we think we need to live out, which impact the relationship that is going on. How then, as we're using tapping as a tool, how then do we unpack and recognize when relationship history is showing up in our current relationship as the subconscious programming that tapping is so effective at changing? How do we recognize that's going on in that setting?
I think pain and suffering in the relationship is a big flag. Everybody goes into a relationship wanting to find peace and joy and comfort and all manner of things like companionship or whatever, and then quite often find that the reverse is the case, because there's so much kind of triggering that goes on. So I always say, when I'm working with people, it's you need a kind of vigilance. If you spot the soonest kind of moment where you feel just even a little bit irritated or a little bit just not okay, out of kilter or whatever, pause and work with that, work with the feeling of that, because our systems are alerting us all the time to when we're out of balance. Something has triggered us, and when that's going on at an unconscious level, which is where it all starts, obviously. We don't know what that's about. We might even have a stomach ache or something like that, or we'll just feel very, very irritated that the fridge the milk hasn't been put properly in the fridge.
And emptied the bins. That's the classic, isn't it?
Yeah. All of those things, and they, actually, if something's not in the right place in the fridge, if you really think about it, that is not a cause for the kind of anguish and anger and irritation that can erupt over, those kind of things. So what I'm saying really is that kind of, eruption of over the top emotion starts somewhere much smaller. And if you get so that you're accustomed to kind of addressing that and just doing it quick. I'm a great one for short, sharp bursts of tapping at the earliest possible moment. And then we bring ourselves back into alignment.
And I think there's two interesting things that you said inside of that. Number one is when we're getting this information, you're saying that is something that is worth investigating. And I love that, like I don't even know how conscious and deliberate it was, but that sense of curiosity that is in that question, that it's not, I need to be fixed or they need to be fixed or the relationship is wrong. And maybe it is possible the relationship is wrong. Maybe there's something bigger that is going on. But what you're flagging here is this is an opportunity for investigation. The second thing I think is really interesting that you said in there is you also said that sometimes when we are distressed in the context of a relationship, it is something else. And this is just the place that it's playing out on. A decade ago, I dated an absolutely amazing woman who, when she was hungry, became very short and very cranky. And it was something that she knew. Like, she was like, just so you know this about me, this is the reality of what's going on, and know that I always travel with snacks. And it was just like, she just recognized that when blood sugar or whatever dropped inside of her, it dramatically impacted her, and it was something to be aware of. And so it was a really great piece of information to recognize, oh, someone might be being short with me, and it's not about me, and it's not about the relationship. This just happens to be the venue that's playing out on. And I think that's one of the reasons why dealing with relationship issues becomes so difficult, is because I'm in a circumstance where I'm experiencing something and I'm looking at some direction. And in a relationship, I'm looking at someone else. And so I'm going, I see this, I feel this, and it may or may not be connected to that, which, loops back to something you said very, very early on, Emma, is this idea of the place that we start doing relationship work is the relationship that we have with ourselves. And I would love it if you could kind of like unpack what you mean by that particular statement or phrase.
I'm not sure I would necessarily think of it as the start, but I would think of it as actually the aim, the intention.
Okay, great. Awesome. Yeah, talk to me about what you mean by that. Yeah.
Well, obviously, when someone turns up and they want to work on relationship issues, you've got to start with where they're at. You can't suddenly launch into, and it's all about your relationship with yourself, because you'll never see that client again. You'll probably scare them out of your practice room. But once you've explored kind of what relationships actually mean to them, what they see their role as in different relationships. If someone comes in with a romantic relationship, I'd still be looking at all their other relationships as well, because they'll have areas where they will consider themselves to be successful, usually. And if you're successful in one and not the other, then what's going on, what's happening, what's interfering, and who are you in each of these different relationships? And then when you explore that and unpick some of the key memories of where you've created these identities, you are then in a place to actually connect to yourself rather than to others. Because people come in with relationships, as Sue was saying, I'm not good, I can't do them, they're not for me. Or they come in, right, he's a real pain, he's not, and that's even harder because that's kind of projected out there, whereas actually ultimately we want people to start taking responsibility for their own role. So it's painstaking work, I think, actually, that unraveling of your relationship with yourself and the you that you want to bring into a relationship. And then when you've explored that and who that person is, who you'd like to be in a relationship, what stops you? What are the blocks to that? What's getting in the way? And what are the triggers? What are the triggers to connecting to yourself, really? Because, often people go, this is all about him. I'm okay. But they wouldn't really be in therapy if that was what they really believed.
And what's interesting inside of that, you kind of like systematically unpacked a number of things in there. It was, first we figure out, how do we define ourselves in a relationship? The second is, how do we know that is true? Because sometimes I think, exactly. When we start to unpack the reason why we define ourselves and our characteristics in a particular way, sometimes we're going to get to, how do you know it's true that you are bad at relationships? And I might have a relationship history. I might have the men in my family are never good at relationships. But by just asking, great, so you define yourself this way in relationships. How do you know that is true? That starts to unlock those history pieces. And then the second piece of it is like, having someone articulate clearly who we want to be in a relationship, which I think is a different question than what's the type of relationship that you'd like to have. Now, I think in a healthy, well-nuanced conversation in an emotionally intelligent person saying, what type of a relationship do you want to have? Part of that is, how do I want to show up and who do I want to be in a relationship? Exactly. But sometimes we think of it, again, as this relationship as this thing that is external. I am me and I have this relationship. And by going, great, who do I want to be as I show up into that becomes really, really different. And so then we get the opportunity to ask the questions, great, if this is who you want to be, what is the thing that is preventing you from taking the action and being that particular way? And so by doing those two ends of it, how we define ourselves, why is that? That gives us a bunch of tapping stuff. Who do I want to be? And what is the baggage around that? Because it might be, this is who I want to be, but the last time I hoped for that, I failed. Therefore, I don't even want to aspire to it. Or I can't because my history, I've made enough mistakes, whatever those particular pieces are. But I like looking through those two different lenses because it gives us this entire library of places that we can step in to start doing the work.
Absolutely. And also, Sammy, people often look at Sue and I, we've been working together in a relationship, I suppose, partnership, business partnership for 22 years. And people often go, well, you're really lucky, you've got this really good working relationship. What they don't recognize is, we both work at it. It's not a thing that we've got. We haven't suddenly been given this thing. It's a continually evolving thing which involves respect, mutual respect and trust and a lot of humor for us. Those are the key values that we have. But it's not a static thing. It changes. The Sue and I who started working together 22 years ago are not the Sue and I who you meet here today. It's a very different thing. So the word relationship makes it static.
Yeah.
That's the great joy of it as well, is the evolution, isn't it? And in any successful ongoing relationship, it's about the change and the evolution, and the room for growth, and that sort of mutual awareness and respect of each other's progress within that.
And as you say that, I think that's interesting because like the three of us are in a circumstance where we approach relationship from this idea that one of the fruits of relationship is growth and change. And not everybody approaches relationship in that exact same way. Like some people are actually looking for relationships that don't change. For whatever reason, they make the decision that life is easier and safer and more comfortable. And so like that then becomes one of those things that is going to create conflict inside of a relationship if the person you are in a relationship with has a different goal of the relationship. You know, is this something that is going to grow and change over a period of time? Is this something that, no, I actually need this one thing in my life, and this relationship provides that one thing in my life, and I don't actually want that particular thing to change. And, you know, I think the three of us are working from a disposition of like, that's actually an impossibility for something to be that static. But if the person that we're engaging with or the people we are engaging with in a friend circle, if there's different goals about that particular thing, then it becomes particularly hard. And as I say that, like, you know, one of the things that, you know, as I'm in my late 40s now, I had a whole number of relationships that in my early 20s grew apart, and then as we got into our early 40s grew back together as like we changed we were changing at different rates. And so like sometimes the necessity of change means that relationships change in really dramatic ways, and there's a grieving process for that. And sometimes they grew back together and sometimes they don't. Like there are people from my 20s I've grown apart from that I thought I was going to be lifelong friends with, and I still think the world of them, but, you know, haven't interacted with them maybe than like a thumbs up on a Facebook post in 3 years. And like being okay with, or deciding whether or not you're okay with the fact that relationships are going to change and evolve in that particular way. Because if we're not able to accept that, then we're going to, as we change, stay attached to relationships that are not evolving in the way that we are, which is going to cause a huge amount of distress.
I think that's really important, actually. That I haven't really kind of fully thought about it until now, as we're talking about it now. But the fear of change is what prevents a lot of people from actually having intimate relationships. I think, and my observation is that a lot of relationships don't last for forever. You know, I mean, all types of relationships. Right. You know, some of them are profound, but last, you know, like a moment. Just, you know, that thing when you just sort of encounter somebody like on one day.
Sliding doors.
Yeah. And I just think that every single encounter that we have with another human being is significant, even if it's one that only lasts just a kind of nanosecond. It's a very sort of brief party, but we kind of give something to each other, even if it's a smile, passing in the street. And some do last. Some last a lifetime. And that's an amazing thing. Or sometimes, you know, one of the partners die, but the relationship, you know, the connection lasts forever. So there's all sorts of things that, you know, that the sort of physical encounter can be however long, but it doesn't, you know, to me, it doesn't necessarily it's not a quality thing. It's not like that's necessarily any better than another. It's just how it is that, you know, we're constantly kind of, you know, they're like sort of, there's something holy, like you know, just, you know, they're spiritual. Really,
and one of the things that we're coming back to over and over and over again in this is like how insufficient a word relationship is. A number 3 decades ago, a friend of mine wrote a book about dating and relationships for teenagers, and the book was called Real Love in a Pizza Love World. And at the beginning of the book, she's talking about the fact how you can like love your mother and love your partner and love pizza. And like, we use that same word in all of those ways. And like, you know, all of us at some point in the Western world were introduced to the fact that the Greeks had 3 words for love, and like how that becomes this thing that is useful, and recognizing like like what you're talking about there, Sue, is not just like the nature of the relationship. Is it family? Is it co-work? Is it romantic? But like the evolving nature of it, and then the duration of it, and how those things are radically different inside of it. And if we're anytime we're engaging with a one-size-fits-all approach to something, it's going to be really hard for us to do that. And so I could see, as I'm wrestling around with what we're talking about here, like a nice, easy, gentle first step in tapping about this is giving ourselves permission in Steve Wells's intention tapping parlance. I give myself permission to release my emotional attachment to the definition of what a relationship is.
Yes, that's one. Yeah.
And giving ourselves permission to step into it in that particular way, because if I just have a bunch of round holes, I'm going to be doing lots and lots of forcing with whatever shaped pegs that I have, and giving myself permission to go, okay, no, I'm going to give myself permission to let go of this definition of what a relationship is in this particular scenario, so that I can co-create something with someone else where we're like having consent to deciding what that particular thing is. And I guess the other thing is, as I think about that, like all of that makes perfect sense. And I'm like, oh crap, now I have to have really hard conversations with the people in my life. Like it's hard to be able to say, actually, I'd like our relationship to be, or just to say, hey, this is how I see our relationship. Like, even if I have a good, healthy relationship and me making that statement, I am opening up the person on the other side going, oh no, I don't think that's what our relationship is like at all. And like, it's almost ignorance is bliss. And I'm just going to assume we have the same definition. And so I can see like how valuable it is to give myself permission to have this open, figure out what it is, but also to like tap to feel safe and comfortable and connect in a way where I can actually share what my intent and my desire is.
I think there's one key thing that we've kind of not touched on really. You mentioned the word once, but it's conflict. It's people's responses to conflict and how people deal with conflict within relationship. And you're talking about your brother and you rolling around on the floor, play fighting or whatever. People bring that younger self and its experiences into their response to conflict. And that is, I find, one of the key parts that kind of needs to be addressed, actually. You say one thing, I hear something completely different according to my history. Therefore, we're just missing all the time. So that's something that actually I think needs to be resolved fairly early on, or at least addressed, recognised. So that then when conflict shows up, your client can kind of think to themselves, well, actually, what does, that classic question, what's this remind me of, actually, this feeling? Is it I'm used to being criticised, so I'm hearing criticism everywhere, because when I grew up, I was criticised all the time. Or I'm unlovable, therefore, whatever you say to me, I'm not going to believe it, which is very kind of disempowering for the person who's showing the affection. So it's kind of like different languages and responses to
and so as we get back to this very vague and imprecise word of relationship, like we're talking about how do we learn about relationships, because it's not taught. That's the place that we started. And so there's all of the things that you're talking about there, Emma, in, how I am treated, how I understand what is going on, like my experience with other people. And then we then also lay over the top of that the way that relationships are modeled for us, that in a subconscious way, our first family, whoever we spend time with in those initial years, is a circumstance where we just assume they're teaching us the way the world works. And so,
more to the point, that's the right one.
That's right. Yeah. This is the way it works, like the archetypal version of all of these things. And so then we see, the imperfect relationships that are surrounding us, because relationships are imperfect. And we're also in a circumstance where even if we have really wonderful, well-modeled relationships in front of us, we're also 5 and 6 years old and don't understand the nuance of adult relationship. And it's really easy for us to misinterpret the stories of what's going on. And so as we're unpacking our history and seeing how we show up, it's like, what do I think about relationships because how I was treated? And what did I learn about relationships by the relationships I was surrounded by? And what does that look like? Because we then go, oh, this is what is here, therefore this is what my story needs to be.
Yeah, exactly. And those fundamental beliefs that are created when we're very little, we're based on the decisions or assumables and the vows that we make until certain things happen. We then stick to them. So the me that's being told that I haven't taken, why didn't you take the bins out or whatever it is, why didn't you clean the fridge? It's actually hearing, you're really bad, you're stupid, you didn't do it right. And that 3-year-old will come out fighting. And that's those, with EFT, we can go back actually and get those memories when they come up and work through them. And I think once we have that awareness, we have the ability to really make significant change.
Yeah. I think in a way, you can think that all conflict is really between kind of regressed parts of ourselves. All conflict is something about what you're doing triggers something about what me, and we're 5 years old together and locked in a fearsome unresolvable conflict. Does conflict really, when we're kind of coming from our sort of balanced, mature, whole adult self, there isn't really conflict. There's conversation, and there's agreement to change, and there's just the ability to relate, And then I'm just having the thought that when we think about conflict on a bigger scale, on a world scale, is all that about kind of regressed states and parts, and what?
Don't get me started.
No, just sort of occurring to me now that what we see in the therapy room, where people have so much pain, and then that pain just dissolves once they're able to actually get at the specific times, the memories that's being triggered by what's going on now. And I'm not saying that this happens overnight. This is it's kind of a lifelong journey, but it's not possible to really have the feeling of conflict in the sense of being at war with another person when you're coming from your kind of authentic true self.
And as you say that, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is in relationships very recently, in the last 18 months or so, I've found myself using the vocabulary my preferences. And as I've thought about that, like I'm starting to sort out in all things, but relationships, it shows up a lot. There's a difference between my need, my desire, and my preference. Like my need is to eat dinner. My desire is to do it around 7:00. My preference is Japanese food. And so like I engage with those things differently. But if I am not creating a difference between a preference, a desire, and a need in a relationship, my subconscious mind assumes everything is a need. And if my needs are not being met, I am now in danger. And so I want this thing out of a relationship. I define that as a need. I'm not getting it. I'm in danger, where it could be, actually, my preference is to have this, and you and I can have a conversation about what your preference is and my preference is, and we can come to some sort of agreement of something we're going to do together or agreement of something we're going to do separately. But I respond to that so much differently than this primal, this is my need is not being met, therefore I am unsafe. And so recognizing this thing that I'm trying to receive from the relationship. Is it a need? Is it a desire? Is it a preference, or whatever words work for a person? And that helps us to have a communication and engage with that relationship in a healthier way.
That's brilliant, actually.
I really love that.
It's fantastic. Yeah.
And the fascinating thing I found about that is that just saying that to people. So my preference is this, and you can literally see them just kind of go, oh, that's a really different way about talking about that particular thing. And you can just immediately see the person on the, even if it's not a conversation about something that is contentious, but you can immediately just see them just relax just a little bit, going, okay, this is a different type of conversation because of the way that you stated that particular thing. But it required me to have this internal understanding of the difference between those things.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah,
I actually think that's what we do, Sue, but I wouldn't put it in that frame.
Exactly. Yeah, but that's a very good frame, because there's a lot of this thing of getting my needs met. That idea. It's all over the place in therapy. All types of therapies. And it's very wrong to not get your needs met. is it? Well, no, you'd probably prefer.
Well, and what you're talking about here is this, you're talking about this spectrum where, oftentimes coming out of a number of Western spiritual, philosophical traditions is head down, be happy with what you get, just be okay with it. And so it's almost like the pendulum has swung the absolute opposite direction of must be self-actualized, must have your needs met, must be in this particular place. And it's probably somewhere in the middle where it's like we do want to be in healthy, safe, happy relationships where I can care for myself and have my needs met. But it's also I'm not just purely a consumer in the world having my needs met. There's something that's happening in the give and take inside of that.
That's right. I mean, in fact, and are your needs really needs in the primal needs sense? Of course, we all need our actual needs met, like food, shelter, and
attention, actually.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting you say that, so like when having these conversations for the summit this year, I always ask people, hey, what are you interested in talking about? And Dawson Church said, I want to talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And he's like the thing that's in front of his mind is something from 1948, but recognizing like the nuance inside of that how quickly that when we don't have adequate vocabulary to describe our experience and what is coming in, the subconscious mind is very good at making everything black or white. I must have it or I must repel it. And the nuanced work that you guys have been talking about, the tapping that we do and figuring out relationships is escaping that and recognizing the nuance of the type of relationship at this moment in history for the length of a relationship and how all of that is a moving target.
And how we have to question the language that we use all the time,
all the time.
All the time.
The funny thing is, like the way, like one of the things that I love about the Renaissance languages like Spanish is the way you ask a question is you just raise your voice. Like you don't have to add the who, what, where, why. Like, meh. And so just doing a lot of that, like everybody at work hates me. I'm like, everybody? Like, and just questioning a single piece of vocabulary. Hey, define that for me. Because if I think everybody at work hates me, then I'm going to walk in with my dukes up because we emotionally respond to the vocabulary we use to describe our world. And so if I describe my world as everybody hates me and I go, everybody, it's like, oh no, really, it's just Judy and David. Hate?
Exactly.
And then it's hate. Well, actually, we just but just by like redefining, like getting some nuance into the vocabulary that we're using to describe our relationship experience. So I can just see, like, as we're describing our relationship history, I've never been any good at relationships. Really? What's the exception? The old Vince Nims, there's always an exception. Great. What's the exception to that particular thing? And starting to be able to it's, I don't know if you all did this growing up here in the States. It was the rage at my age where we had to learn how to diagram sentences and you had to do all of those things, but going in and really looking at the words that we're using to describe our relationships and using that as this amazing doorway to start unpacking these stories, these histories, these archetypes, these static things that we have about something that is not.
Yeah, it's all in the language that we use.
Yeah,
we stitch ourselves up all the time, and that's of course, and that's what we're doing with the EFT and tapping. Right, we become detectives of the language, don't we?
Someone describes something like, great, so what proof do you have that that's the case? How do you know that's true?
Exactly. How do you know? I love that.
How do you know it's true? That's awesome. Yeah, it's true. Great. How do you know it's true? Let's find that out. Let's go chase that particular thing and let's start unpacking that as we move forward.
Is that really true? Well,
right. Yeah. And it's amazing the emotional change, the physiological emotional change when someone goes, well, actually, you could just see that shift happening instantaneously in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. With that sort of inner perception that changes just on the way that we adjust the way we relate to a word the way that word has had power over us, and then we go, oh no. Actually, not always, and then of course that means, so if not always, then actually there are times when when it was okay, or it was good, or whatever, and then that's all blocked until we kind of remove the power of that never.
Yep.
It's amazing, really.
Well, excellent. Well, Sue, Emma, as always, I appreciate our conversations, but this one's going to be noodling around in my head for a little bit, just as I think about the vocabulary we talk about relationships and how that becomes such a useful tool and being able to figure out where our stuck points are. So I just really appreciate your time and your insight.
Well, thank you for inviting us, Jean. I love our chats too. Look forward to more of them.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.